Hello everyone. Few days back I wanted to install Linux on my Windows laptop because of constant heat and freeze. But that problem got solved without installing Linux with just replacement of heat paste. But when I wanted to install Linux, I wanted to understand how operating system installation works. So this video will be all about how OS installation works. So let's start when we press the power button. So when power is on, the CPU wakes up and CPU is hardwired to run whatever the firmware software is. It can be BIOS or BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System and UEFI stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. We will see about that, but its job is to check all the hardware, initialize the hardware, and then find the bootloader. So it finds the bootloader and bootloader finally install OS. So this is what happens. Now we will see everything in detail. So what do I mean when I say CPU is hardwired to run whatever at the firmware? So firmware is not stored in the disk. It is directly installed on the motherboard in a separate storage unit. And that's why when the CPU wakes up, it can run the firmware even before the disk is initialized. CPU knows the location of firmware, so when we power on, it starts whatever is stored at firmware location. It is directly stored on the motherboard in a separate storage unit, and once firmware is run, then it initializes all the hardware. The firmware has two jobs: initialize all the hardware and find bootloader. Firmware runs even before your machine has an operating system, even before disk is initialized. And that's why it is advised to be careful when we update the firmware, because if something goes wrong, it will be very difficult because firmware is the first thing that runs. Now, before I move ahead, I want to leave it right here and I want to talk about the disk. Disk, sector, MBR, GPT. So disk is a continuous memory unit and the smallest unit to which we can read or write is called sector. So sector size is 512 byte on, or in modern disk it's about 4096 byte or 4 KB. And as we know, we partition our disk. Partitioning is not physical, it's logical, it's for us. So we can partition like OS is here, Linux is here, window is here, Linux is here, and things like that. So the data of partitioning is also stored in the disk itself. Now there are two formats to store that. The one is MBR. It's easy, but it has some limitation. That's why in modern system we use GPT. How do we store partitioning data and the bootloader? So at the sector 0 of a disk, we stored two things: bootloader and partition table. So from sector is of 512 bytes, so 0 to 445 byte bootloader is installed. Bootloader is stored, and from 446 to 509 partition table is stored. And 510 to 512 there is called magic number that says this data is correct, something like that. So let me recap it. We power on, CPU wakes up, it started firmware, let's say BIOS. Now BIOS job is to find the bootloader and initialize the hardware. Now let's say our machine has disk 0, disk 1 and a pen drive. So BIOS will look at the disk 0, sector 0, from 0 to 44 byte, and whatever there is, it will run that software. Now when BIOS is running, you can press F12 and go into settings, where you can change if you want to install a OS from pen drive instead of disk 0. Now BIOS works with MBR and UEFI works with GPT. When your firmware is UEFI, it just find the FAT32 EFI system partition on your disk and load the .EFI file. I know it's quite a lot, so let me just now move to double boot. So how double boot works? In BIOS and MBR system, when we have a window and we also want to have Linux, there is only one sector 0. So window has its own bootloader and Linux has its own bootloader. So at the sector 0, only one bootloader can be stored. So when we install Linux, in that process, it replaces the window bootloader from sector 0 to its own bootloader. Now, when now once we have both the operating systems, now when we power on, Linux bootloader gives us option to install either Windows or Linux. If we choose Linux, then it just runs its own bootloader and install operating system. But if we choose Windows, the Linux bootloader will call Windows bootloader. Now in UEFI and GPT system, it's easier because in GPT system we can have different EFI file, one for Windows, one for Linux, and UEFI also store the location for it. So it will give you option to choose one, and based upon your selection it will install that operating system. So let me give you a final recap. Power, CPU, firmware. Now if firmware is BIOS, then it will look at disk 0, sector 0, 0 to 445 byte and run that software. This bootloader will then install the OS. Now if it's UEFI, then it will look at disk 0 and find a FAT32 EFI system partition and look for .EFI file. It will run that EFI file, then it will run operating system. Now in both this firmware, we can change the by default disk 0 by pressing F12, or this can be different in different system. You can change the default disk, you can change it to pen drive, then it will install from a pen drive. I hope I have made sense and made you a little bit more comfortable. It's easier to just copy paste and install operating system, but when you know a little bit what's happening, it's comfortable, it's easy.